We're finishing up chapter 12 and we're talking about other sampling methods. So far we've talked about a census, which can work if you have a very small population, but typically is not very feasible to do. And then we also have talked about an SRS, or a simple random sample, where everybody has an equal chance of being selected. So there are other sampling methods that we can use as well. The first one is a stratified random sampling. So what that is that the population is sliced into homogeneous groups called strata. So each strata have a similar characteristic. So you might break it apart by male or female, or by age or gender, but you're breaking the groups off so that each group is homogeneous. Like one group is all females, one group is all males. Once you have divided the population into homogeneous groups, we then use a simple random sample within each stratum before your results are combined. So you'll randomly select males, and then you'll randomly select the females separately, and then you can combine your results. The purpose to using a stratified random sampling is if you think some portion of the population is going to feel differently based on a specific characteristic. So, for example, if we are talking about whether more funding should go to the football team at a university, we may think that the males and females might think differently. So we might separate them out based off male and female. If we were to ask high school students if they feel that high school campuses should have an open campus, we might think that upperclassmen and underclassmen feel differently because upperclassmen can drive and underclassmen can't. So we might break it apart by grade level. When you break apart population into strata, your samples for each stratum has to be proportional to how it's represented in the overall population. So if we're breaking apart based off of gender, and 40% are males and 60% are females, then 40% of my sample has to be males and 60% of my sample has to be females. So in other words, if I were taking a sample of 10 people, 4 would be males, 6 would be females. So here's that example written out. So again, talking about the college students and how they feel about more funding going to the football program. Again, if the student breakdown is 40% females and 60% males, then we would have 40 females and 60 males if our sample is 100 students, and that will help reduce the sampling variability. Again, a stratified sample can be used to stratify by race, income, age, gender, any other characteristic that you think may affect the results. So you only stratify if you feel that this population is going to feel different than this population. Another sampling method is the cluster sampling. So cluster sampling splits the population into smaller parts or clusters. This is very similar to a stratified sample, except in a stratified sample, the groups are based off of a specific characteristic. In cluster sampling, it's not based off of any type of characteristic, and really it's more or less used to make the sampling a little bit easier. So what happens is you take your population and then you break it down. For example, if we wanted to know how Michigan high schools felt about moving from the ACT to the SAT, we might cluster and make each county in the state a cluster. Then, once you have your clusters, we select one or a few clusters at random, and you perform a census within each of them. So, for example, if we were to pick Oakland County and Kalamazoo County and Van Buren County, we would then ask all of the school districts within those counties how they feel about it. As long as each cluster fairly represents the full population, then it won't be biased. We select our clusters to make sampling, again, more practical and more affordable. Again, a lot of times this is used when your population is very spread out or large. Another example is an administrator at a hospital is concerned that staff may be abusing drugs. In order to make their life a little easier, they could cluster based off of department, and then they would randomly select a few departments and test all of the people who work in those departments. Another sampling method is multi-stage. Multi-stage is when we combine several methods for one sampling scheme. Now, I want to say here that all sampling methods will eventually use a simple random sample, where you number everybody and we have an equal chance of being selected. So using simple random sample with another method is not multi-stage. Multi-stage is like, for example, if we are combining cluster and stratified, then we have multi-stage. So, for example, if we want to assess the reading level of the book, but we are afraid that it gets harder the further you go, we can stratify the book by unit. So then we would have 7 different units. Then we would randomly choose one chapter from each unit. Then we would cluster a few pages together. So I stratified by unit, and then I'm clustering the pages. And then I would use an SRS of the sentences within each cluster. Now, normally I do want to say this, that normally when you have a cluster, when you randomly select your cluster, you normally will do a census within the cluster instead of an SRS. So that also goes to multi-stage. The last sampling method is a systematic sample. So a systematic sample is when you choose people in some type of an order. So this order means that you're picking every 3rd person, or every 7th person, or every 10th person. So there's an order to it. It's systematic. The important thing when you're using a systematic sampling method is that you have to choose your starting point randomly. So you're going to decide randomly that you're going to start with the 7th person or the 5th person. You can't just decide to start at the top, because then people whose last name starts with A get chosen more often. The other thing is that when you're using a systematic sampling method, you have to make sure that the order doesn't matter. So if the order that the people are listed in will affect the responses, then using this method does not work. For example, custom agents check the luggage of every 10th person that comes to the gate, starting with a random customer. So they randomly decided to start with the 7th person, so then they're going to check every 10th person after that. That's a systematic sampling. If they were to check the carry-on luggage of people as they were entering the plane, a systematic method might not work, because the people who have a first-class ticket get to get on first. So that might not work because the order that the people are getting on the plane might have an effect. So looking at an example. So we need to survey a random sample of 300 passengers on a flight from San Francisco to Tokyo. We want to name the different sampling methods that are described below. So you guys should try and figure these out on your own, but of course I'm going to tell you. So you pick every 7th passenger as people board the plane. That's a systematic sample because there's a system to it. You're picking every 7th passenger. From the boarding list, you choose 5 people flying first class and then 25 of the other passengers. In this case, the method here is stratified. You broke it apart based off of a specific characteristic. In this case, you broke it apart based off of the type of ticket. You randomly generate 30 seat numbers and survey the passengers who sit there. This is a simple random sample. Everybody had an equal chance of being selected, and then you pick 30 of them. The last one, we randomly select a seat position, so right window, right center, left aisle, so on and so forth. And then we survey all the passengers sitting in those seats. This would be a cluster. We clustered based off of seat position. We picked one. We survey everybody in that position. So each of these are viable sampling methods. It just depends on what we're interested in. So who's the who? The who of a survey can refer to different groups. You want to start by thinking about the population of interest. So the population of interest is, what are you interested in? So what is your population? Then we think of our parameter of interest. So our parameter of interest, what are we trying to gather? What data do we need? Then we specify our sampling frame. Our sampling frame narrows down our population. So again, maybe I want to know how high school students feel about moving from the ACT to the SAT. So my population would be all high school students in Michigan. Then my sampling frame is going to be narrowed down from there. So now, am I going to worry about only public school students? Am I going to include private school students? Am I going to include homeschool students? What about foreign exchange students? Since homeschool students might not take those tests, or maybe since they're not required to take those tests if they go to a private school, maybe I'm only going to look at public schools. So that narrows down my sampling frame. So my population would be all high school students. My sampling frame would be public school students. So again, it limits what your survey can find out. So I'm limiting it to only one specific group. Then you look at your target sample. So my target sample is high school students. So I would decide what method of sampling I'm going to use, implement it, and then my sample are the people who actually respond. They're the individuals you intend to measure responses from. And again, you determine your sample. Again, these are the actual respondents who you actually get data from. Tomorrow, we'll look at an example of this, but for tonight, that is it. So have a good night, and I'll see you tomorrow.